Ron is here. Let me click on Ron, and here he is. There you are. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. This is wonderful, Ron. Welcome to our hangout.
Thanks. Yeah, I thought I joined, but I guess I hadn't. I've been watching for most of the day.
Have you? What did you think of most of the day?
Well, I've been very impressed by the amount of work that everyone else has put in. I have a much more modest presentation, I think.
But you know, Ron, yours is also quite unusual and rather innovative, and we all need innovation. So, frankly, I'm really delighted you're here at our symposium. You're in a different world, though. You're not, of course, a sign language expert, are you?
No, not at all. I'm a musician, a composer. So I've been using Sutton SignWriting in the music that I've been writing.
Okay, so you start now and just tell us all about it.
Okay. So I decided to write a piece for a facial expressionist and a bassist, and to direct the instructions for the facial expressionist, I chose to use Sutton SignWriting, which I had actually been exposed to through Erica Hoffman-Dillaway, who does research on Sutton SignWriting, and she's the one who put me in touch with Valerie as well. Yeah, it's been very interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Sutton SignWriting might continue to be used in a musical context, and I'm also going to give some background about composing for movement and gesture in general in classical composition.
Wonderful. We have slides, so if you would like that, we can do that, but whatever you wish. You just tell us what to do.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not sure if it's been working for anyone else, but when the slides are up or when something is being shown, an image is being shown that's not a person speaking, then you can't see the sign language interpretation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know if that's not true for anyone else.
I'm so sorry to hear that. We were so hoping it was working because it seemed to be. You know, we really are kind of confused, if you want to know the truth, about the whole way the Google Hangout software is functioning with the interpreting. So I'm really sorry to hear that, but we cannot go back on that right now at this moment. All we can do is just go forward. And then we will just add the interpreting later. We just don't have much choice because we do have recordings, as you know, of what we're doing. So I think we should just go ahead anyway. I'm sorry that you haven't been able to see everything, but oh well. So I'm going to go back to you, and you just tell us if you want us to show a slide, and we'll just go on. And if the interpreting doesn't show up, we'll add it later, okay?
Okay, so should I talk over the slides then, or should I wait?
What do you think, Steve? You think we should? Yeah, I guess so. I think Steve is there.
Yeah, if he wants to wait, that'd probably be best, and that way we can make sure that we have the interpreter and we don't have to worry about it.
That's true. In other words, the old method maybe was the best, which was different, in which you would say, show slide 1, then we'd go to the slide, and you'd pause and not say another word, and then you'd say, okay, back to me, and then we'd go back to you, and that way we really would get the interpreter, I think. So why don't we do it that way, the old-fashioned way? Okay.
Yeah. So you can start with the first slide.
All right, I'm clicking on slide, Steve, and here we are.
And you can go to the next one as well. I think there are 4 bullet points.
Okay, next slide.
Is there any way to make that be the main screen when it shows? Because right now it's just at the bottom. Okay,
what you do is you click on that little box that looks like a small box to you, and it should come up so you can see it. Other people see what I've been clicking on, which makes it bigger, I hope. As you pointed out, we don't even know what we have in the recording until we go see it. But that's what I thought was happening anyway. So
this is great.
All right, so now, should we stay on the slide again, or should we stay with you?
We can go to the next slide, and there are, you can just pause right there.
Right at the standard notation? Is that what you want? Yeah, okay.
So I'm going to begin by talking about how most music in the Western world is typically composed. There is a system in place that is very popular for Western art music and now for more popular forms of Western music. That's partly systematic and partly linguistic, partly iconographic, and largely symbolic. And that is used to convey much different information. And you can go ahead and show the rest of this slide now.
Okay, so now we're going to the slide.
And you can just pause at the bottom there. So musical notation can take a lot of different forms, but visually written out notation is what predominates. And the example that I've given at the bottom is from a piece by Johann Sebastian Bach, his Inventions and Sinfonias for keyboard instruments. The reason I've included it is because it is just an example of something that someone who is trained in reading standard notation would be able to interpret with no difficulty by the age of middle school or so if they had started learning music when they were 5 or 6. And by the time they reach this age, they will have internalized pretty much all of the rules for decoding standard notation. And we can go to the next slide now. And pause right there. So there's some basic information that standard notation conveys. Most importantly and most commonly, the information that's conveyed is pitch and rhythm. And pitch is how high or low a sound is. So if you're looking at a piano, the notes on the top of the piano to the right are the highest notes, and the notes to the lowest are to the leftmost, sorry, are the lowest notes. And that pitch corresponds to fundamental frequency. So higher pitches have a higher fundamental frequency expressed in hertz, and lower notes have a lower fundamental frequency expressed in hertz. And then rhythm, pretty concisely, though it gets more complex, is basically when and for how long a sound occurs. So if you're reading a piece of music, the rhythmic information that you'll get will tell you when the note is to be played in the piece of music and for how long. And so a note, which is the figure in the middle of the slide that you will get to look at again in a second, will most basically convey at least pitch and rhythm. And this is true for all what's called common practice era music, which is music written in Western Europe and places to which this music was exported between about 1600 and 1900. And you can go to the next slide when you're ready.
Next slide, yeah. Wow, look at that.
Just a second. I am pulling something up on my computer at the moment, just for my reference.
Okay.
Oh yeah, so the example that I have up at the moment is an example of actually an educational tool that's called a score identification exercise. And the reason I'm showing this is because in Western art music, there is all of this information that gets encoded and decoded by composers and interpreters. But because the tradition is so rich and so well established, it actually carries much more information than just the notes on the page, as it were. So this is an excerpt from a test that's designed for graduate composers, graduate student composers in a conservatory, and they are expected in this exercise to be able to look at this piece of music and to tell roughly what year it was composed, who is a likely composer, the relevant techniques, the possible form, and all the historical relevance of this information, as well as a complete technical analysis. In this case, this is an excerpt from Richard Strauss's Salome. Composers who are reading this might actually, in fact, know where the excerpt is coming from, if they are well versed enough in the tradition. The point being that this standard notation, this tradition, carries a lot of cultural and historical information, along with simply giving instructions as to what pitches are to be played when and for how long. And all of this information is learned tacitly in order to inform the interpretation of a piece. So that the 12-year-old, for example, who is reading that Bach invention that was shown in the second or so slide, they will be able to read the pitch and the rhythm, but along with that, all of the covert information that's not given just by the notes is how to play the notes, what touch to use on the keyboard, how to express the phrases, how to ornament the phrases, and these are all things that are a part of learning the notation. And you come to gather this information and to learn the stylistic and aesthetic expectations based on what the music looks like, basically. And you can go to the next slide. Yeah, you can just go through the slide. Can you go back one?
Oh, go back one? Okay.
Yeah, right there. No, right there is perfect. So, beginning in the 20th century, composers began to pursue musical interests radically divergent from the artistic values of common practice era music. And confronted with its limitations as well as its inextricable cultural significance, composers sought to expand and reform or outright abandon standard notation in favor of new techniques that were better suited to their musical aims. And many of these techniques came to be integrated into the standard framework. So some of the things that composers started to write in the 20th century eventually came to be expected for the general musician to be able to read and write. At the same time, a lot of other musical cultures, most importantly jazz probably, came to use an adjusted form of standard notation particular to their needs. And in the same vein, musicologists were forced to devise new notational devices for transcribing unprecedented and non-Western music practices that standard notation couldn't adequately describe. So, for example, most other musical cultures in the world, well, not most, but several other musical cultures in the world use a different scale of pitches than we use in the Western world. It's not really important what a scale is, but basically we have 12 pitches in our scale. And that's just the way it is. Most of our instruments are designed on this 12-tone scale, but other cultures have a lot more. Some cultures have up to 40 pitches in their scale, and 20th century composers also began to incorporate these other scales into their composition. But musicologists were faced with the problem of how to notate these scales that just didn't fit into this existing model of notation. And you can go to the next slide now. This is a piece of music. It is an excerpt from John Cage's Cartridge Music.
Wait, could you stop, Ron, and just let us look for a minute, okay? Just give us a moment.
I forgot. Absolutely.
I know, it's hard because we can't use our eyes both places. So I want to look at this. This is amazing. Wow. So, you know, the sad part is that we can't hear you talk about it while we're looking at it, but right. I'm going to go back to you now. Tell us more about it, and then we'll go back again, okay? Because we need to study that.
Yeah, keep giving me those reminders if I need them.
Yeah, I know. We hearing people forget. Go ahead.
So this is a piece of music written by John Cage in 1960, and it is called Cartridge Music. And I'm just showing this to show that a musician who is trained in standard notation would not be able to interpret this music without specific instructions. And in this case, the instructions are that the musician is supposed to use the cartridges that connect to the needles in phonographs and contact them with whatever other devices the performer prefers, and to basically follow these lines in a pace that the performer sets themselves, in order to create a piece of music generated by whatever sounds come out from the motions of the cartridge on the object.
So to summarize this particular slide, this is not the average music, is it? It's using other instrumentation that is not what they used in Bach and Mozart's day. Is that what you're saying?
There are many atypical things about it. The most important of which is that it is written in a way that it would not be obvious to interpret by someone who is familiar with standard notation.
So I'm going to look at it again now. I'm going to click on the slide. Let people look again. So does this notation, is it used by other people? Do you know who uses it? Or is it just very individual?
It is extremely individual. In fact, most composers beginning in the 20th century and beyond who write for such idiosyncratic purposes will develop notational systems that are equally idiosyncratic. If not just for their own projects, then, sorry, if not just for a particular piece of music, then just for their own projects. And in fact, one of the points that I want to make is that there isn't really a generalized script system for composing, among many other things, movement and bodily gesture. So this is extremely unusual, but it became a very strong trend in Western art music to compose in unprecedented ways, such as this.
I see. Great.
And we can go to the next slide now.
Okay. Next slide, there. Composing for movement and gesture.
Yeah, and you can go through the whole slide. Back one.
It goes real fast. I can see the animation must go fast. That's what happens.
Oh, I see, I see.
So we're going to go back one, Steve. Yeah. Somehow it didn't hold.
Great.
Right.
So, one of the many new things that began to interest composers in the 20th century were composing musical or paramusical instructions for performing bodily gestures in a musical context. The articulation of bodily gestures isn't readily incorporated into standard notation, as we saw, and like I just said, there isn't any schema that's popular among composers for encoding these instructions. And pieces that call for the realization of specific gestures, distinct from the realization of a particular sound, that might involve the face or the hands or the arms or other body parts or staging instructions, etc., will almost always require the creation of new notation. And there are a lot of well-known composers with interests along these lines. John Cage was certainly one of them. George Apergui is a composer who is still living and working. And Maurizio Kagel, who was also a prominent 20th century composer. And there are several others. And they each had a distinct way of incorporating physical gesture as instruction into their music and in their notation, in conjunction with or instead of composing along more traditional lines for pitch and rhythm. And I want to show an example of a piece of music that incorporates bodily gesture. So if we go to the next slide.
Yeah, next slide.
And if you click on the link, that's a video of the piece that I would like to show now.
Oh, I don't know whether that's going to work. Okay.
Oh yeah, so it's a YouTube video.
Okay.
Well, we'll see if it works. It does. It's not that important, but it would be cool to show. And just a minute or so would be fine. You can exit the video whenever you think people have had enough. It's a pretty fascinating performance.
Very unusual. Is it supposed to be silent? Here, I'll come back to you now because we want to make sure we can have an interpreter.
Sure.
Is it supposed to be silent?
So, no, the piece is not supposed to be silent. The sound didn't come through. But in fact, one of the devices of the piece is that some of these gestures produce sound. That is, some of the gestures for some of the gestures, the performers are instructed to actually hit the drum. And for others of the gestures, they stop just short of hitting the drum. And the composer in this piece is playing with the notion of the performer being the sounds that she herself makes. And unfortunately, all I can show you of the score is what's in that slide, because there are copyright restrictions.
Okay.
But you can see that the composer chose to use, well, I'll let you look at it for a second.
All right, well, I'm going to click on the slide then, and let's see what we get. It's not this, right? This shows the score. Is that what you wanted?
Yes, this one exactly.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So you can see that the composer has chosen to use a modified form of standard notation that incorporates a lot of linguistic instruction as well as some new symbols. In order to write for instructions that standard notation doesn't already accommodate.
When you say notation, do you mean musical notation? It's an important question since we work with movement notation.
Well, the point that I'm making is that this notation uses standard notation in order to direct movement.
What do you mean by standard notation? I'm sorry, I don't understand.
So, standard notation looks like the picture of the note that was on the slide kind of at the beginning.
Okay.
If we go back to this slide in a second, then you will see that there are staves, which are the horizontal lines, as well as note heads with stems. And those are symbols that are derived from standard notation. But it is being used in a novel way.
Yes, true. For sure. So can I go back to that then and look at it for a minute? Steve, could we go back? Oh, sorry. We're not quite there yet, I guess. Can you see this? I don't know what everybody's seeing, but anyway, there are slides, and I like this, and to me, I thought we were getting the interpreter while we talked when we saw it. See, this way I don't think we probably see the interpreter, because somehow there's a full screen or something like that.
Right, yeah, I'm afraid so.
This is not working, Steve. We need to go back to seeing your desktop like you just had. That's where we would see the interpreter. That's where we see the interpreter, I think. Yeah, I'm sorry to say that's it. That's where we need to be. Right, like that. Anyway, there was a page we were just looking at, Steve, that's a little bit later, the one we just looked at. That is a little bit more right in there, that's right. I guess that was it. Yeah, that one. And
yes.
When you say standard notation, you do mean musical notation notes. You see, Ron, I'm not meaning to interrupt you because I really don't want to, but actually this is like a conversation if you don't mind. Because did you know that in the dance notation world, maybe you don't know about the dance notation world, why would you want to know? But in dance notation, there have been developers who developed notation systems that use nothing but musical notes, but they never represented sound ever. They represented the movements of the human body doing ballet. One of them was Stepanov from Russia. I know you know about this. Mm-hmm. So when we say the word notation in my world, the dance notation world, we mean all kinds of things, and we have to say music notes notation or dance notation in front of the word notation, or we don't know which notation we're talking about. I just thought I'd tell you. Kind of funny, huh? So,
yeah, that's an important distinction to know.
Yeah, so to say standard notation, I'm saying, well, which one? Which standard are we talking about? You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, go ahead, because I want you to truly finish this. It's important to me. I want to see how Sutton SignWriting is used. Tell us how it's used.
Oh, right. Yeah. So this is all backup.
That's right.
Am I speaking slow enough, by the way?
You're
Or
doing
Adam?
fine.
Okay.
Adam is so amazing. He speaks, he signs for me, and I speak much faster than you do.
Yeah, I'm
And
watching those hands flying, so I'm just.
I know,
just
isn't he
patient.
remarkable? But I do want you to know that it's really something, isn't it?
Yeah.
At our time 2:30, but in other words, you have another 15 minutes.
Okay, so I'm gonna crank this out.
Yes.
So the last example that I want to show of a composer who writes for gesture is another contemporary composer named Mark Pollux. But he writes for physical action in a very different way. The movements are much more subtle, and they are written in relation to musical instruments. And his intention is to compose descriptively of physical activity rather than prescriptively of a particular sound, which I think means that he is instructing performers how to move their fingers or their bodies or their mouths in relation to a musical instrument without prescribing what sound should come out, which is kind of the reverse of standard notation, if you want to take an example, where what was written is the sound that the composer wanted to hear. So if Bach wrote a note for the piano, then what he cared about was hearing that note played in a particular way at a particular time. So Pollux is writing it in a different way, writing for the actions for the instrumentalists rather than for what sound he expects to hear. And if you go to the next side, you can let people stare at that for a second. It's a chunky quote from one of his scores.
It says composing for movement and gesture. Is that where? Oh, here's Mark Pollux. Oh, I didn't even see that. Or Marek Pollux. I see.
And the speaker is an example of the audio, but I doubt it will work well, so we might as well skip it.
I don't think that's what we need right now. I want to make sure that in this next 15 minutes that I grasp how SignWriting is used. I'd like to see the faces and things like that.
Yeah, that's immediately after this.
Okay. Very interesting, though. I had no idea. So this is not standard notation, is it?
Well, this is a heavily modified form of standard notation, and he provides extensive instructions for how this is to be interpreted, with significant additional information. But I wanted to show this particular excerpt because you can see in this piece of the score that he uses both the modified staves with notes, as well as a particular kind of tablature for the wind instruments that are being written for right now, as well as linguistic information for how the piece is to be played, which is the script at the top left, as well as iconographic symbols that he developed himself, showing what the performer is supposed to do, which are the little squiggly lines, which are supposed to change both the embouchure, which is the mouth shape and the tone that is produced by wind instruments, and the notes that are being played.
Very interesting.
And when people are done staring at that, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so now to the interesting stuff. So Sutton SignWriting is interesting because it has some unique affordances and limitations as a script system. It is in the context of music. It's kind of like a ready-made script system for non-musical or paramusical or extra-musical gestures that could be used in relation to musical instruments, and that's compatible both with horizontal, which means events based in time, and vertical, meaning things that happen all at once, elements of musical notation, which tend to be very important to composers. You can go to the next slide.
Is this the next slide, Steve?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I wasn't sure. So you can go ahead. I think you can speak, Ron, while we're looking at it, because it appears we're seeing the desktop now, which is good. So go ahead and speak while over there.
So there are interesting limitations to Sutton SignWriting as well. Vagueness, I'm not sure is the right word, but what I mean is that these symbols retain vagueness, which is something that's shared by all symbolic systems, including notation. So, for example, if I write the note E for a performer, which is like what Bach would have done if he was writing for piano, that could mean a range of things. Does it mean 230 hertz or like 239 hertz? There is a wide range of interpretation that's available to the performer, even within the means of the stylistic and expectations. And it's true, not in an artistic context, it's true for just how we interpret symbolic systems in general, like phonemes. We all know that people with accents will produce sounds that are phonemically consistent with our interpretation, but that sound very different. There are features of the articulation that differ, and yet we still understand which phonemes are being produced. So if we go to the next slide. This is an example of a symbol that I used a couple times in the piece. Oh, I'll wait for a second.
I don't even think you... Well, yeah, okay, wait, that's a good...
Okay, so this is an example of a symbol that I used a couple times in the piece. And the instruction that I gave for the performer was that this means eyes half open, open-mouthed smile, and the head tilted toward the wall. But it leaves open how wide open should the mouth be, how many millimeters, what angle should the head be tilted, what should the jaw position be, what should the mouth shape be, and so on. And these are details that are not relevant in a linguistic context. Like if you speak American Sign Language and you perform these actions, then within a complete phrase, you need to do it within only a certain range of motion in order for the audience to be able to tell what you mean, assuming that this has any phonological meaning, which I have no idea if it does. But in an artistic context, in a non-linguistic context, these things are wide open because there's no context for interpretation. There's no precedent for what these things should mean. You can go to the next slide now. So I wrote Problem Child for double bass and facial expression because of an experience that I had mistaking the sound of an instrument for the sound of a human voice. Because for a fleeting moment, the articulation of the sound matched the movement of a person's mouth. So I used Sutton SignWriting in conjunction with standard musical notation for the bassist, as well as the International Phonetic Alphabet. So I exploit one of the vaguely defined features of Sutton SignWriting, which is mouth shape, in order to specify exactly what I want the mouth to look like, so that I can write for a person that they should have a half-open smile, and then write a particular IPA symbol indicating what vowel it should look like their mouth is making.
Wow.
And if you go to the next slide, I'll just let people read that, which is a quote from my score. And if you go to the next slide, this is an excerpt from the score so people can see what it looks like.
It's amazing. Wow.
Um,
It's beautiful looking. I like it. But I want to learn to read it, and I'm going to definitely study it later.
Sure. So the score is available online on my website, and everyone is welcome to. I linked to it at the end. Everyone is welcome to check it out, download it.
Okay, good. That's great.
You can go to the next slide now.
Okay.
So there were a couple challenges particular to this piece. It was, first of all, just a first attempt at working with new musical concepts and technical ideas for me. So I consider it much more as a starting point for future things, rather than this like a finished piece itself. But some of the problems are interesting to consider because they reflect generally on the conveniences and challenges of Sutton SignWriting in a musical context. And composing the piece was largely tied up in the notation, especially because of my own artistic interests in composing musical situations rather than prescribed activities or specific instructions for what exactly should happen. I wanted to leave a wide range of interpretive possibilities. It creates a lot of particular challenges in the case of this piece. So, for example, although I included notes and note heads with different rhythmic values, I didn't include a prescriptive temporal grid, meaning I didn't give people like an imaginary time frame for how to divide events in time and count them and sequence them, which can leave open a very wide range of interpretations for pace and phrasing and form. And the potential trade-off for this is the loss of the illusory effect achieved by precisely coordinating the articulation of the sounds and the facial expressions. And then, as I have in the slide, the facial expressionist is also positioned in front of the bass in order to amplify the illusory effect, but it means that all of the performance decisions have to be pre-planned and they have to know it, each of them, know exactly what's going to happen, rather than allowing for a more spontaneous interpretation in the performance itself. And you can go to the next slide. And this slide is just an example of how there are events loosely organized in time, but without a specific indication of when and for how long each event should happen.
Uh-huh. And so, Ron, when I'm looking at this, you must excuse I just have to really study it later. Is this giving us positions? Is it giving feeling? Is that what it's doing? It's giving the indication that there's a feeling to the music or to the bass, as you said.
Yeah, you could say. There's a suggestion that things should be a certain way, but because it relies on this tradition of standard notation where people can see a notehead and be like, oh, well, I know what that usually means. It probably goes something like this. But I don't specify for exactly how long.
Well, you know what it usually means, but then what does the facial expression give the meaning? Does it give the actual physical facial expression, or does it give feeling or sound?
So to clarify, the top line on the piece is instructions for the facial expressionist. There are two performers. The top line is the instruction for the facial expressionist, and the bottom line is instruction in revised standard notation for the basis. So the top line has instructions for exactly what the facial expressionist should do. And we'll see in the video, 2 slides from now, how the performer realizes these instructions. And I give linguistically what each symbol means in the piece. So for example, the 2 symbols in this slide that we can look at again after I finish talking indicate just 2 differences: eyes half open and mouth half open. And beneath each open-mouthed symbol, there is an International Phonetic Alphabet symbol indicating what the mouth half open should more specifically look like. In this case, it's an
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but it is actually just 2 minutes before your talk should be over. I'm so sorry. I really am. I know that you have a lot more to tell us. And I could go back to the slide, but I also want to make sure that Maria can show up. 1 second for one moment. Maria, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, darling. Well, I'm not seeing you. I think maybe your camera isn't working. I'm not sure.
Okay, hold on.
And you just work on that, and we're going to continue talking with Ron. I just wanted you to be informed, okay? So we're going to continue with Ron. And Ron, I'm going to go back to this slide. Could you maybe go to the next slide or give us a feeling for something else that we could look at quickly? I don't think it would be a video.
So let's skip the video, and if you go 2 slides from now.
2 slides from now, yes.
So not the video, but the one after. The slide after this.
Yes, that's all right. There we go.
So this is an excerpt from another score by Mark Pollux showing staging instructions, and I think it's pretty obvious how Sutton SignWriting could be used in this context to more specifically direct staging instructions. If you go to the slide after this one.
Okay.
You could also very clearly see how it could be used to augment standard notation, such as what Pollux used, but in a more constrained context, which is exemplified in the next slide. And you can go to the next slide after that. So well, let's do it for a second. So I used 2 symbols and used a line to indicate a transition between the 2 different gestures, indicating a range of physical possibilities, which is a technique that could be used in a lot of different ways. Much more specifically, you can make the range suit exactly your needs. And there's also just a more interesting question of what differences in movement will be meaningful enough. So for example, a mouth shape with a certain International Phonetic Alphabet symbol, what makes it different enough in a non-linguistic context and an artistic context? It's interesting because there's nothing for the performer to work against or to work with in interpreting these symbols, so it's kind of completely up to them how to use Sutton SignWriting to realize a piece of music.
Absolutely fascinating. So if I were looking at the possibility, okay, go ahead, thoughts. I'm talking
that's
to
all. So feel free to contact me at this email. That's my website. It has all my other work as well as this the score for this piece, and it'll have the paper up shortly as well.
Oh, this is just perfect, Ron. Please know I appreciate your work. I hope you know that. And don't feel badly we're pushing you around.
No, I totally understand.
It's funny, running one of these has been really interesting, and I've really enjoyed your talk because it's so totally different. I mean, it's completely, absolutely different. But I was raised in the professional ballet world, you know, and I really love music too, just like so many people do. And even though I don't actually read a musical score, I certainly do work with them when I did dance notation scores, you know, big scores. And we used to put dance writing into musical scores all the time. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's not what you're doing. I realize you've got your own very unique development here. And I want to read it very strongly later and get back to you because I love it. I like the idea of having Sutton SignWriting, or at least the facial expressions, it appears. And who knows, you might even want to use speech writing at some point if you're really showing vowels and the IPA sounds. That's amazing. So that's something else we can talk about. And I want to say bravo. Thank you so much for coming.
No, thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.